Economic planning is a resource allocation mechanism that is contrasted with the market mechanism. As a coordinating mechanism for socialism, economic planning substitutes factor markets and is defined as a direct allocation of resources. Contrasted with the indirect allocation mechanism of the market. There are various types of planning procedures and forms planning can take. The level of centralization in decision-making in planning depends on the specific type of planning mechanism employed. As such, one can distinguish between centralized planning and decentralized planning. An economy primarily based on central planning is referred to as a planned economy. In a centrally planned economy, the allocation of resources is determined by a comprehensive plan of production which specifies output requirements. Planning may also take the form of directive planning or indicative planning. Most modern economies are mixed economies incorporating various degrees of markets and planning. A distinction can be made between physical planning and financial planning. Physical planning involves economic planning and coordination conducted in terms of disaggregated physical units. Whereas financial planning involves plans formulated in terms of financial units. Socialist economic planning. Different forms of economic planning have been featured in various models of socialism. These range from decentralized planning systems, which are based on collective decision-making and disaggregated information, to centralized systems of planning conducted by technical experts who use aggregated information to formulate plans of production. In a fully developed socialist economy, engineers and technical specialists, overseen or appointed in a democratic manner, would coordinate the economy in terms of physical units without any need or use for financial-based calculation. The economy of the Soviet Union never reached this stage of development, so planned its economy in financial terms throughout the duration of its existence. Nonetheless, a number of alternative metrics were developed for assessing the performance of non-financial economies in terms of physical output. In general, the various models of socialist economic planning exist as theoretical constructs that have not been implemented fully by any economy, partially because they depend on vast changes on a global scale. In the context of mainstream economics and the field of comparative economic systems, socialist planning usually refers to the Soviet-type command economy, regardless of whether or not this economic system actually constituted a type of socialism or state capitalism or a third, non-socialist and non-capitalist type of system. In some models of socialism, economic planning completely substitutes the market mechanism, supposedly rendering monetary relations and the price system obsolete. In other models, planning is utilized as a complement to markets. Concept of socialist planning equals, the classical conception of socialist economic planning held by Marxists involved an economic system where goods and services were valued, demanded and produced directly for their use value, as opposed to being produced as a byproduct of the pursuit of profit by business enterprises. This idea of production for use is a fundamental aspect of a socialist economy. This involves social control over the allocation of the surplus product, and in its most extensive theoretical form, calculation in kind in place of financial calculation. For Marxists in particular, planning entails control of the surplus product by the associated producers in a democratic manner. This differs from planning within the framework of capitalism, which is based on the planned accumulation of capital in order to either stabilize the business cycle or to maximize profits, as opposed to the socialist concept of planned production for use. In such a socialist society based on economic planning, the primary function of the state apparatus changes from one of political rule over people into a technical administration of production, distribution and organization. That is, the state would become a coordinating economic entity rather than a mechanism of political and class-based control, thereby ceasing to be a state in the traditional sense. Planning versus command equals, the concept of a command economy is differentiated from the concept of a planned economy, especially by socialists and Marxists, who liken command economies to that of a single capitalist firm, organized in a top-down administrative fashion based on bureaucratic organization akin to that of a capitalist corporation. Economic analysts have argued that the economy of the former Soviet Union actually represented an administered or command economy as opposed to a planned economy because planning did not play an operational role in the allocation of resources among productive units in the economy. In actuality, the main allocation mechanism was a system of command and control. As a result, the phrase administrative command economy gained currency as a more accurate descriptor of Soviet-type economies. Decentralized planning Decentralized economic planning is a planning process that starts at the user level in a bottom-up flow of information. As such, decentralized planning often appears as a complement to the idea of socialist self-management. The theoretical postulates for models of decentralized socialist planning stem from the thought of Karl Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Nikolai Bukharin and Oskar Lange. This model involves economic decision-making based on self-governance from the bottom up without any directing central authority. This often contrasts with the doctrine of orthodox Marxist-Leninism, which advocates directive administrative planning where directives are passed down from higher authorities to agents, who in turn give orders to workers. Two contemporary models of decentralized planning are participatory economics, developed by the economist Michael Albert, and negotiated coordination, developed by the economist Pat Devine. Material balances Material balance planning was the type of economic planning employed by Soviet-type economies. This system emerged in a haphazard manner during the collectivization drive under Joseph Stalin, and emphasized rapid growth and industrialization over efficiency. Eventually this method became an established part of the Soviet conception of socialism in the post-war period, and other socialist states emulated it in the latter half of the 20th century. Material balancing involves a planning agency taking a survey of available inputs and raw materials, using a balance sheet to balance them with output targets specified by industry, thereby achieving a balance of supply and demand. Lang-Lerner-Taylor model The economic models developed in the 1920s and 1930s by American economists Frederick M. Taylor and Abba Lerner, and by Polish economist Oskar Lange, involved a form of planning based on marginal cost pricing. In Lange's model, a central planning board would set prices for producer goods through a trial-and-error method, adjusting until the price matched the marginal cost, with the aim of achieving parity-efficient outcomes. Although these models were often described as market socialism, they actually represented a form of market simulation planning. Planning in capitalism intra-firm and intra-industry planning Large corporations use planning to allocate resources internally among its divisions and subsidiaries. Many modern firms also utilize regression analysis to measure market demand in order to adjust prices and to decide upon the optimal quantities of output to be supplied. Planned obsolescence is often cited as a form of economic planning employed by large firms to increase demand for future products by deliberately limiting the operational lifespan of its products. The internal structures of corporations have been described as centralized command economies that employ both planning and hierarchical organization and management. According to J. Bradford DeLong, a significant portion of transactions in Western economies do not pass through anything resembling a market. Many transactions are actually movements of value among different branches and divisions within corporations, companies and agencies. Furthermore, a significant portion of economic activity is planned in a centralized manner by managers within firms in the form of production planning and marketing management where consumer demand is estimated, targeted and included in the firm's overall plan, and in the form of production planning. In the new industrial state, the American economist John Kenneth Galbraith posited that large firms manage both their prices and consumer demand for their products through sophisticated statistical methods. Galbraith also pointed out that, because of the increasingly complex nature of technology and specialization of knowledge, management had become increasingly specialized and bureaucratized. The internal structures of corporations and companies had been transformed into what he called a technostructure, where specialized groups and committees are the primary decision-makers, and specialized managers, directors and financial advisors operate under formal bureaucratic procedures, replacing the individual entrepreneur's role. he states that both the obsolete notion of entrepreneurial capitalism and democratic socialism are impossible organizational forms for managing a modern industrial system. Joseph Schumpeter, an economist associated with the Austrian School and Institutional School of Economics, argued that the changing nature of economic activity, specifically the increasing bureaucratization and specialization required in production and management, was the major reason for why capitalism would eventually evolve into socialism. The role of the businessman was increasingly bureaucratic, and specific functions within the firm required increasingly specialized knowledge which could just as easily be supplied by state functionaries in publicly owned enterprises. In the first volume of Capital, Karl Marx identified the process of capital accumulation as central to the law of motion of capitalism. Increased industrial capacity from increasing returns to scale further socializes production. Capitalism eventually socializes labor and production to a point where the traditional notions of private ownership and commodity production become increasingly insufficient for further expanding the productive capacities of society, necessitating the emergence of a socialist economy where the means of production are socially owned and the surplus value is controlled by the workforce. Many socialists viewed these tendencies, specifically the increasing trend toward economic planning in capitalist firms, as evidence of the increasing obsolescence of capitalism and inapplicability of ideals like perfect competition to the economy. With the next stage of evolution being the application of society-wide economic planning. State development planning State development planning or national planning refers to macroeconomic policies and financial planning conducted by governments to stabilize the market or promote economic growth in market-based economies. This involves the use of monetary policy, industrial policy and fiscal policy to steer the market toward targeted outcomes. Industrial policy includes government taking measures aimed at improving the competitiveness and capabilities of domestic firms and promoting structural transformation. In contrast to socialist planning, state development planning does not replace the market mechanism and does not eliminate the use of money in production. It only applies to privately owned and publicly owned firms in the strategic sectors of the economy and seeks to coordinate their activities through indirect means and market-based incentives. Economic planning in practice. Soviet Union. The Soviet model of economic planning is an economic system where decisions regarding production and investment are embodied in a plan formulated by Gosplan through the process of material balances. Economic information, including consumer demand and enterprise resource requirements, are aggregated and used to balance supply with demand through a system of iterations. The Soviet economy operated in a centralized and hierarchical manner where directives were issued to lower-level organizations. As a result, the Soviet economic model was often referred to as a command economy or an administered economy because plan directives were enforced through inducements in a vertical power structure, where planning played little functional role in the allocation of resources. United States. The United States utilized economic planning during the First World War. The federal government supplemented the price system with centralized resource allocation and created a number of new agencies to direct important economic sectors. Notably the Food Administration, Fuel Administration, Railroad Administration and War Industries Board. During the Second World War, the economy experienced staggering growth under a similar system of planning. In the post-war period, U.S. governments utilized such measures as the Economic Stabilization Program to directly intervene in the economy to control prices, wages, etc. in different economic sectors. From the start of the Cold War and up until the present day, the United States federal government directs a significant amount of investment and funding into research and development, often initially through the Department of Defense. The government performs 50% of all R&D in the United States, with a dynamic state-directed public sector developing most of the technology that later becomes the basis of the private sector economy. As a result, Noam Chomsky has referred to the United States economic model as a form of state capitalism. Examples include laser technology, the Internet, nanotechnology, telecommunications and computers, with most basic research and downstream commercialization financed by the public sector. This includes research in other fields including healthcare and energy, with 75% of most innovative drugs financed through the National Institutes of Health. East Asian tigers equals. The development models of the East Asian tiger economies involved varying degrees of economic planning and state-directed investment in a model sometimes described as state development capitalism, or the East Asian model. The governments of Malaysia and South Korea instituted a series of macroeconomic plans to rapidly develop and industrialize their mixed economies. The economy of Singapore was partially based on economic planning involving an active government industrial policy and high levels of state-owned industry in a free market economy. France equals. Under directive, France utilized indicative planning and established a number of state-owned enterprises in strategic sectors of the economy. The concept behind indicative planning is the early identification of oversupply, bottlenecks and shortages so that state investment behavior can be modified in a timely fashion to reduce the incidence of market disequilibrium, with the goal of sustaining stable economic development and growth. Under this system France experienced its Trente Glorieuses period of economic prosperity. Criticisms. The most notable critique of economic planning came from Austrian economists Friedrich Hayek and Ludwig von Mises. Hayek argued that central planners could not possibly accrue the necessary information to formulate an effective plan for production because they are not exposed to the rapid changes in the particular time and place that take place in an economy, and are unfamiliar with these circumstances. The process of transmitting all the necessary information to planners is therefore inefficient. Proponents of decentralized economic planning have also criticized central economic planning. For example, Leon Trotsky believed that central planners, regardless of their intellectual capacity, operated without the input and participation of the millions of people who participate in the economy, and would therefore be unable to respond to local conditions quickly enough to effectively coordinate all economic activity. See also. Notes.